They say every murderer makes one fatal mistake. Tonight, in the Viscount's secret was worth killing for, we shall discover what that mistake was. I am Arthur Hastings, and this is the Little Grey Cells, where we chronicle the extraordinary cases of my dear friend, Hercule Poirot. First-time listeners, do make yourself known. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of the world is listening tonight. So, Poirot your tisane, find a comfortable chair, and let us engage those little grey cells. The game, as they say, is afoot. Chapter 1. The Harbour at the edge of the world. The egg was wrong. It was not, strictly speaking, the fault of the egg itself. The fault lay with the waiter, a young man of considerable self-assurance and insufficient scientific understanding, who had removed the egg from its pan at precisely 3 minutes and 45 seconds rather than the 3 minutes and 15 seconds which represented, in Hercule Poirot's considered opinion, the boundary between civilization and its absence. "Monsieur," said Poirot, regarding the object before him with an expression of mild sorrow, "this egg has been murdered." The waiter blinked. He had not yet learnt that the small, immaculate Belgian gentleman at table 4 took these matters rather more seriously than most. "I will bring another," the waiter said, and wisely retreated. Hercule Poirot arranged his pocket square, smoothed the already smooth lapels of his pale linen suit, and turned his attention to the harbour. Port Valmera on a fine September morning was, he was prepared to admit, very nearly perfect. The town curved around its crescent of white stone like a smile. A wide, generous smile of a prosperous and contented place. Below the promenade, fishing boats rocked in the marina with the unhurried rhythm of objects that had nowhere pressing to be. Above, the cliffs rose in clean white lines, and between their faces and the sea, the town inserted itself with a pleasing confidence. Shuttered windows painted in faded yellow and blue, balconies trailing the last of the summer geraniums, cafes open to the salt, bright air. Poirot had arrived 3 days ago by the afternoon ferry, accompanied by 1 trunk, 1 hat box, 1 portfolio of largely unread newspapers, and a determination to do absolutely nothing of consequence for a fortnight. He had taken a pleasant room at the Grand Hotel on the upper promenade, and had spent his first morning reorganizing the furniture to his satisfaction. He had spent his second morning correcting, in the gentlest possible way, certain misapprehensions held by the head chef regarding the preparation of tisane. He had spent his third morning, which was this morning, contemplating the harbour and being disappointed by an egg. It was, he reflected, an excellent holiday. Around him, the terrace of the Café Marianne stirred with the particular life of a Mediterranean port. Old men arguing with the passionate precision of those who have nothing at stake. Children running between the iron chairs. A seller of newspapers moving between the tables with the resignation of a man who has long since ceased to expect anyone to buy one. The smell of the sea came in on a warm, lazy wind, carrying with it diesel from the ferry engines and the faint sweetness of citrus from the market stalls along the quay. Poirot observed it all with his customary pleasure. He had always found that other people's lives, examined from a suitable distance, possessed a most agreeable orderliness. It was only when one moved closer that the complications began. He had, of course, noticed the peculiarities of the town. It was not in Poirot's nature to fail to notice things, any more than it was in the nature of a compass to point indifferently in all directions. Observation was not an effort for him. It was a condition, like breathing, performed continuously and without particular conscious instruction. What he had observed about Port Valmera was this, that it was a place which presented itself as open and yet was, structurally, a trap. 3 roads out, all of them climbing through the same narrow defile in the limestone hills behind the town. A ferry twice daily, at 8:30 in the morning and 4:30 in the afternoon. The cliffs, which appeared so decoratively behind the white rooftops, were, in fact, sheer and unscalable. A man wishing to leave Port Valmera at his own convenience and outside of the ferry schedule would find the matter rather more difficult than the cheerful aspect of the harbour suggested. Poirot had noted this on his first afternoon, with the idle satisfaction of a mind that files away geographical facts as reflexively as it files away the expressions on faces. He had also noted the faces. The harbour master, for instance. Captain Luca Marinetti was a substantial man, broad through the shoulders, dark-jowled, with a kind of permanent suntan that spoke of 30 years at sea and 20 years behind a desk, watching other men sail. He laughed often and loudly, in the manner of a man who had identified good humour as a useful tool and kept it well maintained. But Poirot had observed that the eyes, beneath their heavy lids, were not laughing. The eyes were counting, noting, calculating the weight and value of everything they fell upon, and adjusting some internal ledger accordingly. Then there was the journalist. Miss Clara Vance was staying at the Grand Hotel, 2 floors below Poirot. She was an Englishwoman of perhaps 32, with sharp features softened by an expression of studied vagueness. The sort of vagueness, or Poirot had noted, that required considerable concentration to maintain. She carried a small leather notebook in which she appeared to sketch the harbour. Poirot had positioned himself on the second afternoon where he could observe the notebook without appearing to do so. She was not sketching the harbour. She was writing, rapidly and in a hand too small to read, in a notebook that she kept angled carefully away from the world. Father Matteo Alonso was a different matter. The priest spent his afternoons at the sea-wall, standing with his hands behind his back and his gaze fixed on the horizon, with an expression that seemed to Poirot less contemplative than expectant. He was waiting for something. What it was, Poirot could not yet say, but the quality of the waiting struck him as a man who keeps appointments, in not a man who communes with God. The widow, Signora Isabella Rinaldi, dined each evening alone on her hotel balcony. She wore dark glasses at all hours, which, in a woman of her evidently considerable vanity, seemed less a fashion statement than a precaution. She ate little, drank rather more, and watched the harbour below her with the focused attention of a woman watching a place she had reason to watch. And then there was the boy. Thomas sold white flowers along the promenade. Camellias, Poirot had noted with some interest, and a few late-season gardenias. He was thin, 12 or 13 perhaps, with a watchful face beneath a thatch of dark hair. He appeared wherever Poirot went with the reliability of a shadow that has decided to be useful. Twice Poirot had looked up from a café table to find the boy positioned nearby, neither loitering nor departing, simply present in the way that a well-placed piece of furniture is present, inconspicuous and apparently inevitable. Poirot had, on the second afternoon, bought a camellia from him. "You are here often?" Poirot had inquired pleasantly. "Every day," Thomas had said, and offered no further information, and Poirot had not pressed him, because it was, after all, a holiday. The replacement egg arrived. Poirot examined it with the solemnity it deserved, tapped it precisely, and found it satisfactory. He applied himself to it with genuine pleasure. The harbour glittered. Somewhere along the promenade, a violin was playing something Italian and slightly mournful. The morning settled around him in its warm, salt-bright perfection. He was perhaps halfway through the egg when the woman appeared. She came from the direction of the fish market, moving quickly through the light crowd with the purposeful urgency of a person who has somewhere important to be and rather too little time to reach it. She was elegant, in her middle 40s, dressed in a grey linen dress that had the look of clothes chosen for practicality rather than occasion. Her face was pale beneath its light tan, and her breathing, as she reached the terrace, was not the breathing of a woman who had merely been walking quickly. Poirot noticed these things in the approximately 2 seconds that elapsed between the woman entering his field of vision and the moment she stopped beside his table and gripped his arm. He looked up. She knew him. That much was immediately clear. There was no uncertainty in her face, no preliminary query of the eyes that asks whether it has identified the right person. She had come here to find him, and she had found him, and now she stood beside his table with one hand on his arm and looked at him with the controlled expression of a woman who has decided that she will not, under any circumstances, permit herself to break down in a Mediterranean café at 9:30 in the morning. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was low and English and very steady. Poirot set down his spoon. "Madame," he said carefully, "I do not think we have been introduced, and yet you appear to know me." "Everyone knows you." She glanced over her shoulder with a quick, controlled motion. "There is no time. Please listen to me." Poirot waited. It was one of his more formidable skills, the quality of his waiting, and the absolute stillness of a man who has decided that the next useful sound in the world will come from someone other than himself. The woman leaned fractionally closer. "He will kill again," she said, "before the Viscount's secret dies." Then she released his arm. She straightened. She looked at him for one more moment with an expression that might have been relief or might have been apology, and then she turned and walked back into the crowd with the same quick purposefulness with which she had arrived. Poirot sat quite still for a moment. Then he rose to follow her. But at precisely that moment, a gust of warm wind came in off the harbour, unusually strong, and sent the newspapers stacked beside the neighbouring table skidding and tumbling across the terrace in a sudden, papery chaos. A waiter exclaimed. 2 tourists leapt up, and in the 30 seconds of mild disruption that followed, the woman in the grey dress vanished as completely as if the crowd had absorbed her. Poirot stood at the edge of the terrace, looking at the promenades below him. At his feet, blown against his perfectly polished shoe, lay a single page of newsprint. He looked down at it with the expression of a man who has learnt, over many decades, to pay attention to things that arrive at his feet, uninvited. The headline was 3 days old, and printed in a font of the size reserved for calamities. Viscount Adrien Devereux, D's in apparent accident at sea. Beside the words, drawn in black ink by someone's careful hand, a neat, deliberate circle. Poirot picked up the page. He folded it once, with precision, and placed it in the inside pocket of his linen jacket. Then he returned to his table. The egg, he noted with displeasure, had gone cold. Chapter 2. The Company One Keeps. By 11 o'clock, Poirot had learnt 3 things about Port Valmera, and had revised his opinion of his holiday accordingly. The first thing was that the woman in grey was not a guest at any of the town's 4 hotels. He had established this through the simple expedient of a stroll, a sympathetic expression, and a sequence of conversations with 4 separate concierges, to each of whom he had described the woman with mild and apparently casual interest, as though she were a distant acquaintance he had half expected to encounter. None of them recognized her. Their blankness was genuine. Poirot had considerable experience of the difference between a concierge who does not know something and a concierge who has been paid not to say it. The second thing was that the ferry manifest for the previous 48 hours contained no passenger by the name Devereux, nor any close variant of it. Captain Marinetti had provided the manifests with a readiness that was either the natural transparency of an honest man or the calculated transparency of a very careful one. Poirot was not yet prepared to decide which. The third thing was that white camellias, as the oldest woman at the flower market confirmed with the certainty of 40 years in the trade, did not grow within 30 kilometres of Port Valmera. The climate, she explained, was wrong. They required a cooler, moister air than the Mediterranean coast provided. Poirot thanked her gravely, purchased a small bunch of carnations he had no particular use for, and walked back along the promenade with the carnations in one hand and a number of interesting thoughts occupying the region behind his egg-shaped head. He found Clara Vance at the hotel terrace, her notebook open, her pencil moving in what Poirot now understood to be a performance of sketching rather than the thing itself. She looked up as he settled into the adjacent chair with the expression of a woman who had been expecting him and had decided to find it inconvenient. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you've been asking questions about the ferry." "I have been asking questions about many things," Poirot said pleasantly. "It is a habit I find very difficult to discourage in myself. You will forgive it, I hope." She considered him, but in the clear morning light her face was sharper than it had appeared at a distance. The cheekbones pronounced, the eyes a particularly attentive grey-green. She had the look of a woman who had spent years making herself agreeable to people she found tiresome, and had arrived at a competence in it that was almost indistinguishable from warmth. "What is it that you want to know?" she asked. "At the moment, very little that I do not already know." Poirot set the carnations on the table between them with an air of mild apology. "You are a journalist, Mademoiselle Vance. You came to Port Valmera not for the harbour views. You carry a notebook which contains not sketches but notes. And this morning you watched me from the second-floor window for approximately 4 minutes before descending to the terrace." A silence, and the harbour glittered below them. Somewhere a gull made its long, plaintive argument to the sky. "The window overlooks the promenade," she said at last. "Indeed it does. And the Café Marianne, where I was sitting, is visible from it with great clarity. I noticed the reflection, you understand, in the glass of the newspaper stand opposite." Poirot smiled with complete amiability. "I do not say this to discomfit you, mademoiselle. I say it because I think we may have interests in common, you and I, and it would be wasteful to spend the day pretending otherwise." Clara Vance looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her notebook. "You saw the headline," she said, not a question. "About the Viscount Devereux?" "Yes, 3 days ago, apparently, though the paper was older." Poirot tilted his head. "Oh, you knew him." "I knew of him." The distinction, delivered with care, told Poirot rather more than she had perhaps intended. "I've been researching a story about the Devereux family, the inheritance specifically." She paused. It's more complicated than the obituaries suggest. Most things are, Poirot agreed. Will you tell me about it? She glanced around the terrace with the quick, reflexive caution of someone who has been doing it for so long it has become unconscious. Not here, she said. This evening, the library. Poirot inclined his head, gathered his carnations and departed without pressing further. He had, after all, the rest of the morning. He spent a portion of it in the company of Father Matteo Alonso. The priest was at the sea wall as expected, in his customary attitude of forward-gazing patience, and he was a slight man of 60-odd years, with a fine-boned face that time had rendered both gentle and rather remote, as though long practice at attending to other people's suffering had gradually moved him to some philosophical distance from his own. He accepted Poirot's company without either welcome or objection, in the manner of a man accustomed to people sitting beside him and wanting things. "It is a fine view," Poirot offered after a respectful interval. "It is the same view as yesterday," Father Alonso replied, "and the day before. I find it does not diminish." "You are from Port Valmera, mon père." "For 30 years I came from the north." A brief pause. "One comes to belong to a place, eventually, whether one intended to or not." Poirot let another interval pass. The sea moved with its broad, indifferent authority. 2 fishing boats were coming in, and a man on the quay stood ready with a rope, his posture carrying the comfortable certainty of someone who has performed the same action several thousand times. "I wonder," Poirot said with the air of a man following a passing thought, "whether you were acquainted with the Viscount Devereux. I understand he visited this coast in former years." The priest's stillness did not change, but something in it changed quality. It became a different kind of stillness, not the stillness of repose, but the stillness of a man who has decided very carefully not to move. "I knew him a little," Father Alonso said, "a long time ago. He was a man of some complexity, I think." "All men are complex, Monsieur Poirot." The priest turned then for the first time and looked at him directly. His eyes were dark and steady and carried in them something that Poirot identified, with mild surprise, as not grief, but guilt. "Some are merely more inconvenient about it than others." He turned back to the sea. The conversation was, it seemed, concluded. Poirot rose, straightened his jacket, and bid him good morning. He walked away along the promenade with the thoughtful air of a man who has just been given an answer to a question he had not yet known he was asking. Thomas found him at the corner of the Via Marina, as Poirot had rather expected he would. The boy fell into step beside him with the easy presumption of someone exercising a well-established right. He was carrying his flowers in the crook of one arm and eating a peach with the focused attention of youth. Poirot walked. Thomas walked, and the arrangement appeared to satisfy them both. "You were at the Café Marianne this morning," Thomas said eventually, "when the lady spoke to you." Poirot did not alter his pace. "You saw her." "I see most things." No boast in it, a simple statement of operating principle. "She has been in the town 4 days. She doesn't stay at a hotel, she sleeps at old Petra's house, on the Via Corallo, but she gives a different name." "And do you know her real name?" Thomas bit into the peach, considered. "The harbour master knows her. I saw them speaking 2 nights ago by the East Jetty. He didn't look pleased about it." Poirot stopped walking. He looked at the boy with the direct, calibrated attention he reserved for witnesses who were telling the truth, but not quite all of it. Thomas met the look without flinching, which was itself informative. Why do you tell me this?" Poirot asked. The boy shrugged, the elaborate unconcern of the young performing indifference. But his eyes above the peach were doing something more serious. "She asked me yesterday to tell her if anyone followed you, or watched you." He finished the peach. "I thought you should know that somebody wanted to know." "And did anyone follow me? Or watch me?" "Yes," Thomas said. He dropped the peach stone neatly into a rubbish bin as they passed it. "The widow, Signora Rinaldi, every morning since you arrived." He peeled away from Poirot's side at the corner of the Via Sant'Anna, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has delivered his message and has other business to attend to. Poirot watched him go with an expression of thoughtful appreciation. Then he turned slowly and looked back along the promenade. At the far end, at a table outside the Café del Porto, a woman in dark glasses sat with a glass of something cold and a view of the entire promenade. Isabella Rinaldi did not look away when his gaze found her. She lifted her glass in a gesture that might have been a toast and drank. That evening, in the Grand Hotel's small library, Clara Vance placed an old book on the table between herself and Poirot, with the care one accords an object of significance. It was a slim volume, privately printed, its green boards worn at the corners. The letters of the Viscount Devereux, dated 1887. "I found this in a second-hand dealer in Genoa," she said, "6 months ago, when I first began the story." She opened it to a page marked with a strip of paper. "Read the marginal note." Poirot read it. The handwriting was faded brown ink, cramped and precise. "The truth will surface on the next full moon." He looked up. "The full moon," Clara Vance said, "is in 4 days." Poirot was quiet for a moment. From somewhere outside came the sound of the evening ferry horn, low and prolonged, the town's one reliable announcement of time passing. "And the woman who spoke to me this morning," he said. "Where does she fit into your story, Mademoiselle Vance?" Something moved across Clara Vance's carefully composed face. Not distress exactly, something more controlled than distress, and therefore more alarming. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." It was not, Poirot reflected, as he later climbed the stairs to his room, the whole truth. But it was, he suspected, as much truth as Miss Clara Vance was presently able to give, and he had learnt, over a long career, to be patient with the remainder. 4 days. He stood at his window and looked out at the harbour, where the last light was leaving the water in long, reluctant streaks of amber and rose. Somewhere in the darkening town, a woman who had whispered warnings in his ear was sleeping in a house under a borrowed name. A harbour master who watched everything from under heavy lids had spoken to her by the East Jetty and had not been pleased. A priest carried guilt behind the composure of a man long schooled in composure. A widow in dark glasses catalogued his movements with the systematic attention of a professional. And a boy sold flowers that did not grow on this coast. Port Valmera gleamed in the failing light, white and beautiful and entirely closed around its secrets like a fist. Chapter 3. The Signature of the Dead. She was found at 20 minutes past 7 in the morning, before the market opened and before the first ferry had sounded its horn, when the stone steps leading down to the marina were still wet with night, and the gulls had the harbour largely to themselves. A fisherman found her. He had come down the steps in the ordinary way, thinking of nothing in particular beyond his nets and the state of the sky, and had nearly walked into her before he stopped and understood what he was seeing. He stood for a moment, quite still, then turned and went back up the steps at a pace considerably faster than he had descended them. By the time Poirot arrived, having been roused by the hotel's concierge with the breathless inexactitude of a man relaying disaster at second hand, a small crowd had gathered at the top of the steps, and 2 local policemen were attempting, with limited authority, to discourage it from descending. Poirot descended. She lay on the 4th step from the bottom, facing the sea, with the particular stillness that admits no ambiguity. Her grey linen dress was undisturbed. Her hands were folded on her chest with a neatness that nature does not generally provide on its own account. She might, at first consideration, have been sleeping, except that one does not sleep on cold stone steps with one's hands arranged by another person's deliberate care. That was the first thing Poirot noted, the hands. The second was the paper. It was folded once, tucked between the interlaced fingers with the precision of a calling card, as though its presence there had been a matter of some importance to whoever had placed it. Poirot crouched, examined it without touching, and read the single line of handwriting visible through the fold. A secret buried in the tide will rise when the moon commands it. The third thing he noted was the camellia. It lay against the dark stone 2 inches from her right shoulder. White, immaculate, its petals fully open and entirely unmarked by the damp of the steps or the morning air. The stem had been cut, not broken, not pinched, but cut with something sharp and precise, at a clean angle that spoke of deliberateness. Poirot straightened. He looked at the sea for a moment, then back at the woman who had gripped his arm yesterday morning and told him something that had cost her, it now appeared, rather more than she had anticipated. "Eh bien," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "So it begins." The local police inspector was a compact, moustached man named Velarde, who arrived at 8:30, wearing an expression of professional composure that sat slightly at odds with his eyes, which were alarmed. He shook Poirot's hand with the reverence of a man who has read about him, asked 3 questions, and then stood back in the manner of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do is stay out of the way. Poirot approved of him immediately. "The woman's name," Poirot said, "I do not yet know, but she was staying at a house on the Via Corallo, belonging to a woman called Petra. She used a false name. Your men will find the house. You will find, I think, her real documents there, or else their deliberate absence, which will tell us something different but equally useful." Velarde wrote this down without question. "And the flower?" "The flower is significant. White camellias do not grow in this region. Someone brought it here, brought it, I suspect, from some considerable distance, which argues either very careful preparation or resources that most people in Port Valmera do not possess." Poirot paused. "I should like to know which boats came into the marina in the last 4 days. Not the ferry, private craft." "I will ask the harbour master." "Yes," Poirot said with a thoughtfulness that Velarde, who was perceptive, noticed but did not comment upon. "Do ask him." Clara Vance was in the hotel library when Poirot came to find her, and she had clearly been there for some time. The book lay open on the table. Her notebook was beside it, covered in writing that she made no attempt to conceal when he entered. Her face, when she looked up, was very controlled in the way that faces are when their owners have recently made a decision about what expression to wear, and are maintaining it by effort. "You have heard," Poirot said. It was not a question. "The concierge told me at 8:00. She looked back at the book. "The poem, it was in her hand. You recognize it?" "I do. It is from this volume. Page 43. She turned to it without hesitation. She had been there already. The poem was short, 6 lines in an ornate Victorian hand, but with the voice of a man addressing the sea with the theatrical grandiosity of an era that found restraint somewhat beneath it. The 4th line matched what Poirot had read between the dead woman's fingers, word for word. "The letters of the Viscount Devereux," Poirot murmured. He sat down across from her. "And the note in the margin. This same Viscount wrote it himself. The handwriting matches the letters reproduced in the appendix. I had it compared." Clara Vance looked at him steadily. "Someone is using the book, using its contents as a kind of language, a set of signals." "Or a set of warnings," Poirot said. "The question is, warnings addressed to whom?" She said nothing. In the silence, the clock on the library mantelpiece marked the half-hour with 7 small, neat strokes. "Mademoiselle Vance," Poirot said, and with a gentleness that was also, unmistakably, a form of pressure. "The woman on the steps came to me yesterday. She knew my name. She had, I think, been watching for an opportunity to speak with me privately. Someone of that determination and that caution does not arrive in a town alone. She came with a purpose, and it is my strong impression that the purpose was connected to your own." He let a moment pass. "Was she known to you?" The control in Clara Vance's face held for precisely 4 more seconds. Then something behind it shifted, like a weight redistributing itself, and she closed the book with a quiet, final sound. "Her name was Margaret," she said. "Margaret Vance." Poirot was very still. "My sister," Clara said. "She was my sister." He gave her 10 minutes. It was, he judged, and the correct interval. Sufficient for the worst of it to be absorbed. Insufficient for the hardening that comes when grief is left alone too long with itself. When he returned to the library with 2 cups of the hotel's acceptable coffee, Clara Vance had rearranged herself into something that resembled composure and was near enough to it to be treated as such. "She came to find you specifically?" Poirot asked, setting the cups down. "We both came for the same reason. The story, my story. She had been helping me with it for months. She knew the material as well as I did." Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. "We thought it would be safer if only one of us was visible. Margaret was always the more careful. She said that if anything happened to her, I should find Hercule Poirot, that you were staying at the Grand Hotel, and that you were, in her words, the only man in Europe whose curiosity could not be bought." A faint, complicated expression crossed her face. "She clearly made arrangements I was not entirely told about." "And the story you came for," Poirot said. "Tell me all of it, if you please. Not the portion you judged adequate for last evening. All of it." This time she did not hesitate. "The Viscount Adrian Devereux," she said, "had died in a sailing accident off this coast 11 days ago. He was 71, a widower, the last of a considerable English family whose fortune derived from colonial-era holdings, subsequently converted into rather a lot of discreet property. His death had been ruled accidental. His estate, a substantial one, passed under the published terms of his will to a distant cousin named Gerald Holt, yet currently residing in Geneva." "But," Poirot said, "but there is a complicating clause." Clara turned to a page in her notebook. An inheritance clause, buried in an older version of the estate documents. Under the terms set by the Viscount's own grandfather, if a direct blood descendant could be established within 30 days of the Viscount's death, the estate reverts to that descendant entirely, regardless of the will's provisions. She looked up. 30 days from the Viscount's death falls on the night of the next full moon. In 4 days, then. "And is there a direct descendant?" Poirot asked, though something in him had already, very quietly, begun to form an answer. Margaret believed so. She had found documentary evidence, a birth record, a baptismal certificate, suggesting the Viscount fathered a child outside marriage, here in this region, many years ago. The child was given another name and raised without knowing who its father was. Clara's voice was steady, effortful. "Margaret came to Port Valmera because the trail led here. Someone in this town knew the truth. And someone in this town," she said, "has just killed her to stop it from becoming public." Poirot rose from the table. He went to the window. Below, the promenade was filling with the ordinary mid-morning life of the town, indifferent and bright and continuous. 4 days. The murderer had left a poem and a flower beside a body on cold stone steps. It was not the gesture of a panicked man. It was the gesture of a man entirely confident that he would not be found in time, a man who had calculated his margin and found it generous. Poirot, and who found this quality of confidence in criminals uniquely motivating, straightened his jacket, turned from the window, and asked Clara Vance for everything she had. Chapter 4. Questions. Politely put. The Grand Hotel's library was a room of modest ambition. 4 shelves of largely unread books, 2 armchairs of the kind that encourage the occupant towards sleep, and a writing table that Poirot had commandeered without ceremony. By 9:30 he had covered its surface with paper. A map of Port Valmera occupied the centre, weighted at its corners by an inkwell, a paper knife, a small dictionary, and his own pocket watch. Around the map he had arranged a series of notes in his precise, small hand. Names, times, a column of questions, a column of tentative answers considerably shorter than the questions. Clara Vance sat opposite him, and she had surrendered everything. Margaret's correspondence, a sequence of photographed documents, a timeline she and her sister had constructed over 6 months of careful work. Poirot had read all of it with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, which meant in complete silence and without any expression at all. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at the map. "The birth record your sister found," he said. "Where was it held?" "A church archive in a village 12 kilometres inland, San Cristoforo." Clara indicated the hills on the map, faint contour lines suggesting terrain that had no interest in being accessible. The original entry gives the father's name as Devereux, Adrian Robert, English national. The mother's name is recorded as Lucia Ferraro, unmarried of this parish. The child was a boy. The date is 41 years ago. And the child's given name? Marco Ferraro. She paused. "We could find no further record of him past his 3rd year. The mother died of fever. After that, nothing. The boy disappears from the documentary record entirely." Poirot regarded the map. The village of San Cristoforo sat in its hills like a period at the end of a sentence. 12 kilometres. On foot through terrain of that character, perhaps 4 hours. By a vehicle willing to attempt the roads, considerably less. "Marco Ferraro," he said quietly. "If he is alive and 41 years old, he is here, I think, in this town or very near it. Someone knows who he is, and someone else knows who he is and finds the knowledge inconvenient." He tapped the map once with one precise finger. "The question is whether Marco Ferraro knows who he is himself." Clara looked at him. You think he may not? A child of 3, given to whom, exactly? A relation? A family of strangers? Raised under another name in another place? It is entirely possible. Poirot rose, straightened his jacket, settled his hat. I am going to speak with the harbour master. Captain Luca Marinetti's office occupied a square, practical building at the marina's western end, smelling of salt and engine oil, and the particular staleness of a room where the window is opened only under duress. Marinetti himself sat behind a desk of heroic clutter, with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own disorder, which Poirot found, on principle, faintly offensive. He received Poirot with the loud, warm welcome he appeared to extend to everyone. He gestured at the chair opposite with a broad hand, and offered coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting since morning. Poirot declined the coffee with courteous gratitude. "A terrible business," Marinetti said, arranging his face into an expression of civic gravity. "The Englishwoman? I have told Inspector Velarde everything I know, which is not much. She was not known to me." "No," Poirot said pleasantly. He allowed a small silence to develop, the kind that most people feel obliged to fill. Marinetti was not most people. He waited it out with a patience that itself communicated something. "You did not speak with her 2 nights ago, at the East Jetty, after dark?" The pause before the answer was 3 seconds long. Poirot counted them. "Ah," Marinetti said. His tone shifted, not to alarm, but to a kind of recalculation that was almost worse. "Yes. She approached me. She wanted information about the Viscount's accident. The boat, the conditions, the timeline. I told her what I told the inquest. It was rough water. He went out alone despite being advised not to, and he did not come back. And that was all? That was all." He met Poirot's eyes with a directness that was either honesty or a very accomplished imitation of it. She seemed dissatisfied. I could not help that. "The private vessels in the marina," Poirot said, changing direction without announcement, which was a technique he found useful. "In the last 5 days. Can you tell me which arrived and when?" Marinetti pulled a ledger from the desk's considerable chaos with the unerring instinct of a man who knows his own disorder. He ran a thick finger down a column of entries. 3 private craft had come in over the relevant period. A motor launch registered in Genoa, a sailing ketch out of Marseille, and a small hired vessel that had come down from Portofino and was returning there in 2 days. "The ketch," Poirot said. "Its passengers." "A single passenger. A woman travelling alone." Marinetti consulted the entry. "Italian national. Name of Rinaldi." Poirot absorbed this with an outward tranquillity that required some effort to maintain. Isabella Rinaldi had arrived by her own vessel, which meant she had chosen her moment of arrival with precision and had the means to depart on exactly the schedule she selected, without reference to the ferry timetable or anyone else's convenience. "You have been most helpful," Poirot said, and meant it in rather a different sense than the one he presented. He found Signora Rinaldi on her balcony in the early afternoon, as the heat settled over the town with its customary authority and drove most sensible people indoors. She was not most sensible people. She sat upright in the harbour light with her dark glasses in place, a glass of wine untouched at her elbow, and looked at Poirot as he appeared at the terrace below her, with the expression of a woman who has been expecting an appointment and is mildly surprised it has taken this long to be kept. She came down to meet him. Up close, she was older than the distance had suggested, late 50s rather than late 40s. with a beauty that had migrated from the surface to the structure and was rather more interesting for it. Yashi moved with the unhurried composure of a woman who has not been surprised by anything in some years. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I think we have been avoiding each other." "You have been watching me," Poirot corrected gently. "That is rather the opposite thing." A faint, appreciative curve at the corner of her mouth. They settled at a table in the shade, and she removed her dark glasses, which proved to conceal nothing more sinister than intelligent dark eyes and the evidence of recent sleeplessness. "You knew the Viscount Devereux," Poirot said. "For 30 years. We were close friends, at intervals over a long time, the kind of friendship that survives large gaps." She said it without coyness. The thing spoke for itself. "When I heard he had died, I came at once. I wanted to understand what had happened." "And do you understand it?" "I understand that Adrian was an exceptional sailor who had been sailing these particular waters since before I was born, and that the weather on the night in question was rough, but not, by any standard he would have observed, prohibitive." She picked up her wineglass, set it down without drinking. "I understand that he had received a letter 3 weeks before his death that disturbed him considerably. He telephoned me. He said someone had discovered something he had spent a great deal of money and effort to keep quiet." "He told you the nature of this something?" "He told me enough." She looked at the harbour with the expression of a woman measuring how much to give. "Adrian had a son, born here many years ago. A woman he knew briefly. Who died before he could do what he ought to have done. He paid for the child's care, anonymously through an intermediary, until the arrangement dissolved and he could no longer trace the boy." Something moved briefly in her face. "He never forgave himself for it. It was, I think, the one genuine wound in a life that was otherwise rather comfortable." "And the letter told him the boy had been found?" "The letter told him the boy was in danger." She said it very quietly. "Someone had found the inheritance clause. Someone wanted the estate to pass unchallenged. Adrian was to be removed, and the child, wherever the child now was to be removed. The letter was a warning from someone who knew the plan and had a conscience insufficiently strong to act on it, but sufficient to write an anonymous note." Poirot was still for a long moment. Around them the terrace ticked quietly in the heat, the ice in a neighbouring glass cracking and settling. "The child is here," he said, "in Port Valmera. Adrian believes so. Before he died, he came to this coast specifically. He was looking." She met Poirot's eyes. "He was 68 days too slow." Poirot walked back along the promenade in the flat, white heat of the afternoon, his mind moving in the ordered, sequential way he found most productive. Not rushing towards conclusions, but laying each established fact beside the next and observing what shape they made together. The Viscount had known his son was in Port Valmera and had come looking. He had not found him, or had found him too late. This someone had arranged his death at sea with sufficient care to satisfy an inquest, which required either considerable nautical knowledge, local authority, or both. Marinetti controlled every vessel that entered and left the marina. Isabella Rinaldi had her own boat and her own schedule. Father Alonso had been in Port Valmera for 30 years and carried guilt in his eyes. And Marco Ferraro, called now by some other name, living some other life. Ignorant perhaps of everything that made his life valuable to one party and dangerous to another, was somewhere in this white, beautiful, circumscribed town. Poirot stopped at the corner of the Via Sant'Anna. Thomas was there as usual with his camellias. He was serving a customer, head bent, counting change with the careful economy of the poor. Poirot watched him. The thin wrists, the dark hair, and the watchful, private face that missed nothing and explained nothing. He thought about a child of 3, given to strangers, raised under another name. He thought about a boy who sold flowers that did not grow on this coast. He thought about all of it for rather a long time, standing in the afternoon heat with his hands behind his back and his eyes resting on a child who looked up, eventually, and found him there, and looked back with the serious, unsurprised expression of someone accustomed to being observed by people who were working something out. Poirot bought a camellia. "Your grandmother," he said, with the careful lightness of a man placing a stone on a scale to see which way it moves. "She was from this town." Thomas considered the question with an attention that exceeded its apparent weight. "She was from San Cristoforo," he said. "I'm in the hills. But she came here when my father was small, because there was more work." He held out the change. Poirot waved it away, took his camellia, and walked on. He did not look back. He did not need to. The shape the facts made together had become, in the last 30 seconds, considerably clearer. 3 days remained until the full moon. He walked faster. Chapter 5. The boathouse at the edge of town Poirot slept badly, which was unusual, and woke at 5 with the particular clarity of a mind that has been working through the night without the inconvenience of consciousness to slow it down. He lay in the half-dark and assembled what he knew. The Viscount was dead. Margaret Vance was dead. Both deaths served the same interest: the uncontested passage of a considerable English estate to a distant cousin in Geneva, and a man named Gerald Holt, about whom Poirot as yet knew almost nothing, which was a deficiency he intended to remedy. The mechanism in each case was different: a sailing accident for the Viscount, something arranged on stone steps for Margaret. But the architecture was the same: clean, unhurried, invisible to the authorities who were meant to look at it. Whoever had designed this had also, Poirot reflected, left camellias and poetry beside the body of their second victim. That was the detail that did not fit the clean, unhurried architecture of the rest. A man of this patience and precision did not leave decorative signatures out of carelessness. He left them deliberately, which meant they served a purpose. The question was whether that purpose was directed outward, at Poirot, or at Clara Vance, or at the town generally, or inward, through the private vanity of a man who had waited a long time for his moment, and found he could not resist the flourish. Poirot considered both possibilities with equal seriousness for some minutes. Then he rose, dressed with his customary precision, and went out into the blue, early morning of Port Valmera to pay a call on Father Matteo Alonso. The priest was not at the sea wall. He was in the small sacristy behind the Harbour church, a dim, cool room smelling of beeswax and old stone, engaged in the arrangement of vestments with a concentration that suggested he found the task either very important or very useful as a reason not to be elsewhere. He looked up when Poirot appeared in the doorway without any surprise whatsoever. "I have been expecting you," Father Alonso said. "I rather thought you had." Poirot entered and closed the door behind him. "May I sit?" The priest gestured at a low wooden chair with the wordless courtesy of a man who has spent decades making people comfortable before delivering difficult news. Poirot sat. Father Alonso set down the vestments and folded his hands, and looked at him with the dark, steady eyes that carried, at close range, a weight of reckoning that the sea wall and the morning light had partly obscured. "You knew the child," Poirot said. Not an accusation, a statement placed between them like an object to be examined jointly. A long pause. Through the thick stone wall came the distant sound of the harbour waking. Ropes, engines, voices. "I baptized him," Father Alonso said, "in San Cristoforo 41 years ago. I was a young priest then and new to the parish. The mother, Lucia Ferraro, was a quiet woman, very devout. The father did not attend the baptism. He said the last sentence without judgment, which itself expressed a judgment. When she died, I helped arrange the boy's care. He was sent to relatives of hers in Genoa. I lost contact. I told myself, that was the end of my responsibility. And then, Poirot said, and then 8 years ago a young man appeared at my door. He had found the baptismal record. He had spent years tracing backward from the Genoese relatives, who had kept him only briefly before sending him on, and on, and on again as unwanted children are sent. He came to me wanting the name of his father. Father Alonso was quiet for a moment. I gave it to him. And his name? The name by which you know him now? The priest looked at him steadily. If I tell you, Monsieur Poirot, and he is not safe, if what has happened to the Englishwoman happens to him, if you do not tell me, Poirot said with a gentleness that had iron in it, and he is not safe, the consequence is the same, except that I have been denied the ability to prevent it. He held the priest's gaze. I am not the danger in this room, mon père. Another silence, shorter this time. The beeswax smell and the old stone and the weight of a decision 41 years in the making. Ferraro, the priest said. He kept his mother's name. He came back to this coast 8 years ago after I told him. He wanted to be near the place where she had lived. He paused. He sells flowers. He has a son. Poirot was very still. A son. 13 years old, the mother died 4 years ago. An illness. It is only the two of them now. Father Alonso looked at his folded hands. The man's name is Nico Ferraro. He has a stall at the flower market on the Via Pescatori. And the boy, you have seen the boy, I think. Thomas, Poirot said. Thomas, the priest confirmed, and something in his face settled into a terrible, exhausted relief, as though the word had been held under pressure for a very long time and had finally been permitted to escape. Poirot sat with this information for precisely the time it took to walk from the sacristy to the Via Pescatori, which was 6 minutes at his usual pace and 4 at the pace he found himself adopting. The man behind the flower stall was lean and dark-haired, somewhere in his early 40s, while with Thomas's watchful eyes in an older face and the kind of quietness that is not shyness, but self-containment. He was arranging bunches of late roses when Poirot arrived, and he straightened and looked at him with an expression of measured wariness that confirmed without a word being spoken that Father Alonso had not been his only visitor this week. Someone has spoken to you already, Poirot said, about the Viscount, about the inheritance. Nico Ferraro set down the roses. A woman came 4 days ago. English. She told me who my father was. A pause. I already knew. Father Alonso told me years ago, and I made my peace with it. I did not want money that was not earned. I did not want to make claims on a man who had never acknowledged me. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of a decision long settled. I told the woman so. Margaret Vance, Poirot said. Yes. Something shifted in his expression. She is dead. Yes. Nico Ferraro looked at the flowers for a moment. She was not a bad woman. She believed in the justice of it. But justice that arrives 40 years late is not always worth the cost of collecting it. He looked up. What do you want from me, Monsieur Poirot? At this moment, only to know whether anyone else came to you, before the Englishwoman, or after. The wariness in his face sharpened into something more specific. A man came, 2 weeks ago. He did not give his name. He said he represented certain interests connected to the Devereux estate. He said that if I or my son were to pursue any claim, formal or otherwise, we would find the process extremely, his word, uncomfortable. He said it without heat, in as though reporting the weather. I told him I had no intention of pursuing any claim. He did not seem entirely satisfied. He wanted more than your refusal, Poirot said. He wanted your silence. I thought so too. Nico Ferraro returned to his roses with the decisive air of a man closing one subject and opening another. My son has nothing to do with any of this. I should like it to remain that way. That, Poirot said, is precisely what concerns me. Inspector Valadi met him at the edge of the market with a piece of intelligence that shifted the morning's geometry considerably. The documents from the house on the Via Corralo had been found, among them, a folder of correspondence between Margaret Vance and a London solicitor, detailing the inheritance clause and the 30-day provision. More usefully, it's a carbon copy of a letter she had sent 10 days earlier to a firm of Geneva lawyers, notifying them of her intention to file a formal challenge to the estate disposition on behalf of a direct Devereux descendant. And, tucked into the back of the folder, a single sheet in a different hand, a list of names, written in the cramped, precise ink of someone who did not intend it to be found, with brief annotations beside each. Marinetti's name was on it. Beside it, 2 words. Controls access. She knew, Poirot said. He read the list twice, folded it, and handed it back to Valadi. She came here knowing that one of the people in this town was managing the whole arrangement. The harbour, the movements, the disappearances. She knew who, or nearly. He paused. And the killer knew that she knew. Then the documents were the motive for the first murder, Valadi said. One of the motives. The other was simpler. She was very close to the truth, and the deadline is in 3 days. And a dead woman cannot file legal challenges with Geneva lawyers. Poirot looked at the harbour, flat and silver in the late morning light. We must move quickly. He had intended, by this point in the morning, to return to the library and reorder his notes in light of what Father Alonso had told him. Instead, he found himself redirected, because Thomas appeared at his elbow with the silent materialization that had become a feature of the investigation, and said, without preamble, that a man from the flower market had told him something. A fisherman, the previous night, had seen a light in the abandoned boathouse at the western edge of the harbour road. Not a lamp. Something smaller and repeated. A torch, perhaps, signalling. Or searching. Poirot looked at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at the western harbour road, which curved away past the marina and out of sight behind a stand of dusty pines. You will stay here, he told Thomas. Thomas looked at him with an expression that communicated clearly that he would do no such thing, and that they both knew it. Then you will stay behind me, Poirot amended, with the pragmatism of a man who has dealt with determined young persons before. And you will do exactly as I say, precisely when I say it, and not one moment before or after. Is that understood? Yes, Thomas said, and fell into step behind him. and Poirot walked toward the Western Harbour Road with the careful, purposeful tread of a man who suspects he is walking into exactly the sort of situation he would have preferred, at his age and with his respect for personal neatness, to avoid. Chapter 6. Fire and its Instructive Aftermath. The Boathouse was a low, salt-weathered structure at the far end of the Harbour Road, built into the cliff face so that its rear wall was solid limestone, and its front gaped open to the water on rusted iron runners. It had not been used in years. This was apparent from the state of the doors, which hung ajar at angles suggesting long abandonment, and from the vegetation that had established itself with patient determination across most of the landward approach. Poirot stood at the threshold for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust from the bright Mediterranean morning to the interior dimness, and allowing his nose to perform the preliminary analysis that it was often better equipped to provide than his eyes. Salt, rust, old timber, and beneath these, faint but present, something more recent, the mineral sharpness of documents stored in a damp place, and the faintest thread of tobacco smoke, perhaps 12 hours old. Someone had been here recently. He went in. Thomas remained at the door as instructed, which Poirot noted with quiet approval. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, perhaps 15 metres deep, its far end disappearing into shadow where the cliff absorbed the building. The floor was uneven stone, damp in places, with the remains of old wooden cradles for boat hulls. Along the left wall, a workbench, and above the bench, shelving, mostly empty. On the shelving, a tin box. Poirot lifted the lid of the tin box with the care of a man who has learnt not to hurry this particular class of moment. Inside, a bundle of papers secured with a length of brown string, and beneath them, a small leather wallet containing what appeared to be several official documents in Italian. He unfolded the uppermost paper. It was a ledger page, hand-copied, detailing a series of transactions across a period of 18 months. The account names were ciphered, but the amounts were not, and the amounts were considerable. Running down the right-hand column were a set of dates, the most recent of which fell 11 days ago. The date of the Viscount's death. The second paper was a copy of a letter, unsigned, addressed to a numbered account in a Swiss bank, and the language was careful and legible and said, in plain terms, that the agreed service had been rendered satisfactorily and that the second instalment should be transferred on the specified date. Poirot stood with these papers and felt, somewhere behind his sternum, the cool, unpleasant sensation of a man who has found what he was looking for and wishes, provisionally, that he had not found it quite so neatly. Documents this damaging do not hide themselves in tin boxes in abandoned boathouses. They are put there with their brown string and their careful arrangement by someone who expects them to be found. He was still considering this thought when he heard the footsteps outside. They came from the Harbour Road rather than the cliff path. Two sets, unhurried, not attempting concealment. Poirot stepped back from the workbench. He looked at the tin box, at the papers in his hand, at the single entrance through which, in approximately 10 seconds, whoever was approaching would pass. Then he looked at Thomas, who had already, without instruction, moved the shadow beside the door, with the instinctive economy of a boy accustomed to disappearing when adults required it. The footsteps stopped outside. A pause of perhaps 5 seconds, which is a very long time when one is standing in a dim boathouse holding papers that someone has gone to considerable trouble to plant. Then the smell reached him. Petrol. Not the ambient diesel of the marina, which had been present since he entered, but fresh petrol, poured in quantity, very recently on the seaward side of the building where the old timber of the hull cradles and the door runners had been drying for years. Poirot moved. He was not, as he would have been the first to acknowledge, a young man, and he was not built for the kind of rapid physical problem-solving that the next 40 seconds required. But he had, over a long career, developed a working relationship with urgency, and he permitted it now to override the instinct for dignity that normally governed his movements. He crossed the boathouse at a pace that surprised him, took Thomas by the arm, propelled him through the gap between the hanging doors and out onto the stone apron at the water's edge. And they were perhaps 8 meters from the building when the interior, assisted by 3 decades of dry timber and whatever had been poured against the outer wall, became briefly and comprehensively a different kind of place. The force of it moved the air. Poirot staggered, recovered, and turned. The boathouse burned with the focused enthusiasm of something that has been encouraged to do so. Thomas looked at it, then at Poirot, then back at the fire with the expression of someone filing the experience under a category he expects to need again. "The papers," the boy said. Poirot looked at his own hands. He was still holding them. The ledger page, the letter copy. In his haste he had carried them out without thought, tucked against his jacket, and the jacket had protected them from the worst of the heat. The edges were brown. The contents were legible. "Yes," Poirot said. He looked at them with rather more satisfaction than the circumstances strictly warranted. "The papers." He sent Thomas back to town immediately, firmly, and with instructions to go directly to his father's stall and remain there. He then remained at a safe remove from the burning boathouse until Velarde arrived with 2 officers, at which point Poirot delivered his account of events with the precision of a man who has had several minutes to compose it and has used them productively. He did not mention the footsteps. He said the fire appeared to have started from the seaward side. He did not say that the timing of its commencement, relative to his presence inside the building, was unlikely to have been coincidental. Velarde looked at him with the expression of a man who is performing arithmetic. "The papers," he said. "I will retain them for the moment," Poirot said, "and deliver copies to you this afternoon. There are people in this town I should like to have not yet heard that they exist." Velarde accepted this with the pragmatic trust of a man operating somewhat outside his usual jurisdiction, and turned his attention to the fire. Poirot walked back along the Harbour road in the warm morning, his jacket singed at the hem, and his mind in a state of ordered agitation. The documents were planted. He remained certain of this. Their purpose had been to draw him in and then destroy him, and the evidence together, leaving the investigation without its most inconvenient participant, and the killer with one fewer problem on the eve of the full moon. It was a plan of considerable elegance, and it had failed by a margin measurable in seconds and a nose sensitive to petrol. What it confirmed, or beyond the obvious, that the killer had been watching him closely enough to know he would follow the fisherman's intelligence to the boathouse, was that they were now running. The patience of the preceding weeks was eroding. 2 days remaining and 2 complications still unresolved. Poirot himself and the living Ferraro line. He turned this over on the walk back, and he was still turning it over when he reached the Grand Hotel and found Clara Vance at the entrance, pale and in motion. "She is safe," Poirot said at once, because Clara's face asked the question before her mouth did, and she had had enough of that particular answer going the wrong way. "Someone was at my room," Clara said, "while I was at breakfast. The lock was not broken. They had a key or something equivalent. My notes, Margaret's correspondence, the copies I had made of her documents. She stopped. All of it is gone. Poirot looked at her steadily. Your notebook? I had it with me. She held it up, the small, dense written leather notebook that never left her person. But everything else. Then they have the originals and believe they have the copies. They do not know about the documents I recovered this morning. He guided her inside, away from the entrance and the eyes of the promenade. You will move rooms. Today to one that faces the interior courtyard rather than the street. You will take your meals here rather than the terrace, and you will not go anywhere alone until this is finished. Clara Vance looked at him with the expression of a woman accustomed to managing her own dangers, to whom being managed was a foreign and not entirely welcome condition. 2 days, Poirot said quietly. That is all I ask. 2 days of caution. She accepted this with a nod that communicated both compliance and reservation in equal measure, which Poirot considered a reasonable compromise. He went upstairs to his own room and laid the salvaged papers on the writing table and looked at them for a long time. The ledger entries, properly decoded, would take time. Time he would give them this evening. The letter was more immediately useful. Its language was deliberate, but its geography was narrow. A man with access to both a private vessel and to the marina's authority could have arranged what the letter described. A man who controlled every boat entering and leaving the harbour, and who had his own resources beyond the official ledger, and who had, that morning, while Poirot was at the Boathouse, or been conspicuously absent from his office. Poirot noted this last fact with the careful neutrality he applied to conclusions he was not yet fully prepared to draw, and turned to the window. Below, on the promenade, the afternoon was assembling itself in the usual way. The striped awnings, the tourists, the violinist at the seawall playing something plaintive and unresolved. Thomas was at his corner, flowers in the crook of one arm, watching a gull dismantle someone's abandoned pastry with philosophical detachment. He was safe. His father was at the market. The church was 200 meters away. Poirot watched the boy for a moment with the particular attentiveness of a man who has understood, this morning, with a clarity assisted by petrol smoke and scorched lapels, if that understanding who the target is and keeping them safe are two entirely different problems. He turned from the window and began to work on the ledger. Chapter 7. The Pattern in the Tide. The ledger took Poirot the better part of the afternoon. It was not, in the end, a cipher of great sophistication. The account names were replaced with geographical references, ports, capes, headlands along the northern Mediterranean coast, which was the kind of substitution favoured by men who trust their own cleverness rather more than is entirely warranted. Once Poirot had identified the key principle, which required approximately 40 minutes and the back of one sheet of the hotel's writing paper, the columns resolved themselves into something legible and rather worse than he had expected. 3 accounts. 18 months of transactions. The sums flowing into the first account were irregular in timing, but consistent in scale. Large international transfers from a numbered institution in Geneva that Poirot strongly suspected would prove, on investigation, to connect to Gerald Holt or an instrument he controlled. The sums flowing out of the second account were smaller, more frequent, and distributed to a pattern that suggested payments for services rather than investments. A series of individuals, across a period of time, receiving money in exchange for something that the ledger did not specify, but that the timeline made suggestive. The earliest payment predated the Viscount's death by 9 months. The third account had received a single transaction 11 days ago. The amount was considerable. The date was the date of the Viscount's death at sea. Poirot sat back from the papers and looked at the ceiling of his hotel room for a moment with the expression of a man who has confirmed what he suspected and finds the confirmation not gratifying, but heavy. Then he picked up the second document, the unsigned letter to the Swiss bank, and read it again with the ledger's arithmetic fresh in his mind. The phrase he had noted on first reading, "The agreed service had been rendered satisfactorily," sat now in a context that removed whatever ambiguity might previously have softened it. Someone had been paid to drown a Viscount, and the payment had been authorized from Geneva. He went to see Isabella Rinaldi. She was on her balcony in the early evening light, and she watched him climb the exterior stair to the first-floor terrace with an expression that suggested she had been sitting there specifically in order to be found, which Poirot took as either an invitation or a performance of one, and kept both interpretations simultaneously in mind. "You have been busy today," she said as he settled into the chair across from her. It was not quite a question. "I have had a most instructive day," Poirot agreed. The boathouse, the papers, the fire, a room searched, a ledger decoded. He looked at her with the steady, comprehensive attention that people sometimes found unsettling. And a great deal of thinking about the relationship between patience and greed, and the specific point at which the first gives way to the second. Isabella Rinaldi looked at her wine glass. The harbour below them was turning gold in the evening light, the water very still, the fishing boats coming in with their usual unhurried authority. A beautiful scene. The kind of scene, Poirot reflected, that continued to be beautiful entirely without reference to what was happening in front of it. "You knew about the inheritance clause," he said. Not an accusation, a marker placed on the table. "Before you came here, you knew about Gerald Holt and his interests in Geneva, and you knew that Adrian Devereux did not sail into rough water alone by accident." A silence that was not a denial. "Adrian telephoned me 3 weeks before he died," she said at last. "He told me about the letter he had received, about the clause, about the plan that was already in motion." She turned the glass slowly in her fingers. He was not a frightened man, ordinarily, but that last conversation, he was frightened. "And you came here to do what, precisely, after his death?" "To find the child." She said it simply. Adrian never stopped looking. He had very much wanted to make something right before it was too late, and it became too late before he could. "I thought, if I could find the boy and ensure he was protected, and bring what I knew to someone capable of acting on it." She stopped. "I am not a detective, Monsieur Poirot. I am a woman of 61 with a boat and some useful connections and a very strong feeling about justice. I did not quite know how to proceed." "The connections," Poirot said. "You have documentation of Holt's involvement?" "Letters. Adrian kept everything. He was meticulous in that way, which I always found tedious and now find rather providential. His solicitor in London holds the originals. I have copies aboard my boat." Poirot looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without evasion, which in his experience meant either honesty or a species of confidence that had moved beyond the need for evasion. "You will give me those copies," he said, "tonight, and you will move your boat to a berth that is not on the main marina. I will ask Velarde to arrange it. Your vessel is the only reliable route out of Port Valmera that does not pass through the harbour master's ledger, and I should like it to remain available." She looked at him with an expression that was almost amusement. "You are expecting things to become worse before they become better." "I am expecting," Poirot said, "that someone with 2 days remaining and a great deal to lose will make a decision tonight, and that the decision will not be in our favour." He was back in his room by 9 o'clock with Isabella Rinaldi's copies added to the salvaged documents from the Boathouse, and the complete picture assembled before him on the writing table with the satisfying, terrible clarity of a thing finally seen whole. Gerald Holt, in Geneva, had discovered the inheritance clause through the estate's lawyers sometime in the preceding 2 years. He had also, through some means not yet established, though the 9 months of preliminary payments in the ledger suggested a long and careful preparation, discovered that a direct Devereux descendant existed and could potentially be identified. He had engaged Marinetti, who controlled the harbour, who had the local knowledge, the local authority, and the absence of visible motive that made him the ideal instrument. Marinetti had arranged the Viscount's death at sea. He had managed the suppression of anything that might surface afterward. And when Margaret Vance had arrived and begun asking questions of the wrong people with the wrong persistence, he had arranged her removal too, with the signature flourish of the camellia and the poetry, which was, Poirot now understood, not vanity at all, but misdirection, a symbol pointing away from a practical man toward a theatrical one, a false signature. The camellias were the Viscount's known emblem. Someone had used them to imply that the murders were connected to the Devereux family's internal history. A grievance, perhaps, or a legacy dispute with its roots in the past. Poirot had been meant to look backward into decades of family complexity, while the danger moved forward in the present on a very specific timetable. He had looked backward, but not, he thought now, for long enough to cost him what mattered. He arranged the papers in a new order, the ledger first, then the letter, then Isabella's copies of Adrian's correspondence with Holt's lawyers. Then, at the end, a single sheet on which Poirot wrote, in his small, precise hand, a sequence of events from 9 months ago to the night after tomorrow. He read it through once. Then he went to find Velarde. Velarde's office smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular anxiety of a man who has been a provincial police inspector for 20 years and is currently involved in something that exceeds the usual provincial dimensions. He listened to Poirot's account with his elbows on the desk and his eyes moving between Poirot's face and the documents spread before him with the expression of someone counting the implications and finding the number larger than he had anticipated. When Poirot finished, Velarde lit a cigarette, looked at it, and set it down without smoking it. "Marinetti," he said. "Yes. He has been harbour master here for 16 years. He is known to everyone." He said it not as an objection, but as a statement of the specific gravity of the situation, the weight of 16 years, and the knowing of everyone pressing down on the scales. "I understand," Poirot said. Nevertheless, Velarde picked up the cigarette again and this time smoked it. "You want him watched." "I want him watched without his knowing it, and which requires more delicacy than the watching itself. And I want the Ferraro family moved tonight, quietly, without drama, to somewhere he cannot reach without passing through your officers. Poirot paused. There is one more thing. Of course there is. Tomorrow evening I intend to announce, in a setting where the information will reach Marinetti promptly, that the boy Thomas has been taken into formal police protection and removed from Port Valmera on the evening ferry. Poirot looked at him steadily. He will not, in fact, be on the ferry. He and his father will be in the Harbour church, which has 2 entrances, both of which I should like your men to know very well by tomorrow night. Velarde looked at him for a long moment. And you? I, said Poirot, will be in the church also. Outside, Port Valmera was settling into its evening habits, the cafes filling, the promenade luminous with the last of the day's light, the harbour carrying the quiet sounds of boats at rest. It looked, from Velarde's window, entirely as it had looked when Poirot arrived 4 days ago. Open, beautiful, and entirely at peace. One day remained until the full moon. Poirot straightened his jacket, collected his hat, and walked out into the evening with the measured step of a man who has set his trap and must now wait with all the patience he possesses for the other party to walk into it. Chapter 8. The Last Afternoon. The morning of the final day arrived with the particular serenity that the Mediterranean reserves for its most inconvenient moments. The sky was an uncomplicated blue. The harbour sparkled with an enthusiasm that seemed, and under the circumstances, faintly indecent. Even the gulls were quiet. Poirot ate his breakfast, an egg, cooked to the correct duration and served without comment by a waiter who had learnt, across the preceding week, to approach this particular guest with appropriate gravity, and considered what remained to be done, and in what order. The Ferraro family had been moved the previous night. Velarde's officer had handled it with a discretion that impressed Poirot. A quiet word at the flower stall at closing time, a brief and ordinary-looking walk toward the church, and then nothing visible at all. Nico Ferraro had gone without argument, which suggested either that his characteristic self-containment extended to emergencies, or that he had been expecting something of this kind, and had decided, when it arrived, to trust the man with the small moustache who had been asking careful questions about his family for the last 2 days. Thomas had gone with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has decided to treat the entire business as educational. Clara Vance was in her interior room, writing, which was where she had been since yesterday afternoon, and where Poirot intended her to remain until nightfall. She had accepted this arrangement with better grace than he had expected, which he attributed either to grief working its way through into a quieter phase, or to the fact that she was using the imposed confinement to produce, in her small, dense hand, the complete account of everything she and Margaret had discovered over 6 months. It would be, Poirot thought, a useful document, in several senses. In Isabella Rinaldi's boat had been moved at first light to a small private berth at the eastern end of the harbour, behind a chandler's warehouse, accessible by a path that did not pass the harbour-master's office. She had done this herself, quietly, while the marina was still largely asleep. These arrangements completed, Poirot turned to the one remaining question: the performance. He found his opportunity at 10:30, in the most public setting Port Valmera offered. The terrace of the Café Marianne, where he had sat on his first morning with his corrected egg and his ignorant contentment, and which still served as the social clearinghouse of the promenade. He chose a table well positioned for audibility, ordered coffee, and waited for the right ear to arrive within range. It took 12 minutes. My Captain Marinetti made his daily promenade at this hour with the regularity of a man who has long since ceased to consider whether his habits are visible, passing the café on his way from the harbour master's office to the market where he bought his lunch. He slowed as he passed Poirot's table, in the manner of a man who has been observing someone for a week and has developed the habit of noting their whereabouts. Poirot looked up and offered a greeting of such warm spontaneity that Marinetti, who was a cautious man, paused slightly before returning it. "Ah, Capitano, you find me in better spirits than yesterday, I am happy to say. The business with the fire? Most unpleasant. But progress has been made." Poirot gestured at the adjacent chair with the expansive confidence of a man sharing good news with a friend. "The boy and his father. Inspector Velarde has been most efficient. They leave on the 4:30 ferry this afternoon. Proper protective custody. All arranged. The boy will be taken to the regional authority in Genoa, where the inheritance matter can be addressed through the correct legal channels, away from all this." He waved a hand at the harbour with a gesture encompassing its beauty and its recent history of difficulty. "It is the safest thing. The danger here is resolved." Marinetti listened to this with the attentive stillness of a man filing information. His large face arranged itself into an expression of civic relief. "Good news indeed," he said. "The town has had enough unpleasantness." "It has, and it will have no more, I think." Poirot smiled with the serene satisfaction of a man whose work is essentially done. "I intend to take the morning ferry myself tomorrow. My holiday has been somewhat disrupted." They parted with mutual expressions of goodwill. Poirot watched Marinetti continue along the promenade toward the market, walking at his usual pace, with his usual breadth and solidity, and nothing in his bearing suggesting urgency. But the hands, Poirot noted, were not swinging at his sides in their customary way. They were held very slightly in, at the level of the pockets, as a man holds his hands when he is thinking hard about something, and does not wish the thinking to show. In the afternoon, Poirot did something he had not permitted himself since the first morning. He sat in the sun and appeared to do nothing at all. He sat on the promenade bench nearest the Via Sant'Anna, Thomas's corner, empty today, in the familiar spot of pavement unoccupied for the first time since Poirot's arrival, and somehow more conspicuous for it, and let the afternoon move around him. Tourists passed. A pair of old men argued over a newspaper with leisurely ferocity. A child dropped an ice cream and expressed views about this at considerable volume. The ferry horn sounded at 4:30 from across the harbour, and the ferry departed, and Poirot noted with quiet satisfaction that Marinetti was standing at the harbour office window watching it go. He watched the ferry for rather longer than a man watching a routine departure needed to. Good. Poirot rose from the bench at 5 o'clock, bought a newspaper he did not read, and walked to the harbour church. The church of Sant'Anna was a small, old building of whitewashed stone, its interior cool and dim, even in the heat of late afternoon, smelling of the same beeswax and old stone as the sacristy where Father Alonso had made his confession 3 days earlier. Nico Ferraro and Thomas were in the room behind the vestry, which had a stone floor and a single high window, and the functional austerity of a space designed for storage rather than habitation, but serving now as a reasonable substitute for safety. Thomas was playing cards with one of Velarde's younger officers and appeared to be winning, which Poirot noted without surprise. Nico Ferraro sat against the wall with his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man exercising a great deal of control over a small space. He looked up when Poirot entered. "Tonight," he said. It was not precisely a question. "Tonight," Poirot confirmed. "You will both remain here, only in this room, with the door locked from the inside, until I come for you personally. Not Villardi's officers, me, myself. If anyone else comes to that door, regardless of what they say, you will not open it." "And if no one comes?" Nico asked. "Then we will have been cautious to no purpose, and you can return to your stall tomorrow morning, which is an outcome I would find entirely satisfactory." Poirot looked at him steadily. "I do not think that is what will happen, but I should like very much to be wrong." Thomas set down his cards and looked at Poirot with the direct, undeceived gaze that had been one of the boy's consistent characteristics from the beginning. "He will come himself," he said. "The harbour master, not someone else." "Why do you say so?" "Because he always comes himself," Thomas said, you with the certainty of a boy who has spent 3 years selling flowers on a promenade and watching the same people walk past every day. "When something needs doing, the other men from the marina, they do the ordinary work. But when it matters, he is there." He picked up his cards again. "I have seen him. At night on the East Jetty, when the boats come in late. He is always there himself." Poirot looked at the boy for a moment, at the thin wrists and the watchful face and the collected, serious intelligence that had been filing observations into its ledger for years, without knowing precisely what they were for. "You have been very useful," Poirot said with a sincerity he did not trouble to soften into anything more casual. Thomas received this with a nod of simple acknowledgement and returned to his cards. Villardi met Poirot in the nave at 6 o'clock, and they spoke in low voices beside a side chapel where a candle burned with small, steady persistence before an old wooden Madonna. "4 men," Villardi said. 2 at each door, plain clothes. They have been in position since 5. He looked in the dim light of the nave, like a man who has passed through doubt and arrived at the flat, quiet country beyond it, where there is nothing to do but proceed. "And Marinetti?" "He spent the afternoon at his office. He left at 5:30. He did not go home." Poirot had had this information from the youngest of Villardi's officers, who had followed Marinetti with the unremarkable presence of someone who belongs everywhere and is noticed nowhere. He walked toward the eastern end of the harbour road. He did not take a boat. "On foot, then, and he knows the town well enough to approach from any direction. He has known every centimetre of it for 16 years. Poirot looked at the Madonna, at her painted expression of weathered patience. "He will come between midnight and 2 o'clock, early enough to move before the moon is at its height, late enough that the streets are empty." He paused. "He will be certain that the boy is here because I told him the boy was gone. A man like Marinetti does not miss the implication." Villardi was quiet for a moment. From somewhere outside came the ordinary night sounds of the town. Music from a café, a motorbike in the upper streets, the water against the harbour wall. "And you," he said, "you will be here." "I will be in the nave," Poirot said. "In the dark. I find the dark on occasion clarifying." Villardi left, but the church settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the candle and the distant sea. Poirot found the chair nearest the side chapel, placed it where the shadow was deepest, and sat. He had no expectation of sleep. He had, instead, the particular alertness of a man who has set in motion everything he is capable of setting in motion, and must now, with all the discipline at his disposal, simply wait. The candle burned, the Madonna watched. The night came in off the water, smelling of salt. Outside, somewhere in the whitened town, a man who had arranged 2 deaths and attempted a third was walking through the empty streets in the dark, toward a church where a boy was waiting, who should, by his calculation, no longer be there. Chapter 9. Checkmate by Candlelight. He came at 20 minutes past midnight. Poirot heard him before he saw him. Not footsteps which were silent, but the particular quality of silence that changes when a careful person enters a building. A slight shift in the air, a barely perceptible compression of the darkness near the south door, which was the smaller of the 2 entrances, and the one that Vellardi's officers had been instructed to leave, apparently unwatched. Apparently. Poirot did not move. He sat in his shadowed chair beside the side chapel, with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes adjusted to the dark, and he watched the south door and waited. The door opened 4 inches, paused, opened further. A figure entered and stood for a moment just inside the threshold, doing what Poirot had done on entering the boathouse, allowing the eyes to adjust, allowing the nose to report. The moonlight came through the high windows in long, pale rectangles that fell short of the south wall, and the figure remained just outside them, which was either caution or habit, and, with Marinetti, Poirot suspected, the distinction was not always clear. Then the figure moved toward the vestry. "Capitano," Poirot said from the shadow. Marinetti stopped. The stillness lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It was a different quality of stillness from any Poirot had observed in him before, not the calculated patience of the Harbour office, not the performed geniality of the promenade, but something stripped of performance entirely. The stillness of a man who has just understood that the geography of a situation is not what he believed it to be. Then he turned slowly toward the sound. "Monsieur Poirot," he said. His voice was entirely level. But to whatever recalculation was happening behind his heavy-lidded eyes, it was not reaching his voice. "I did not expect to find you here." "No," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "I had rather counted on that." He did not rise from the chair. He had considered this. Whether the moment required him to stand, to move into the light, to adopt the posture of confrontation that such scenes are generally understood to demand. He had decided against it. There was something in the contrast, the large, powerful figure of Marinetti standing in the moonlit nave, and the small, precise figure of Poirot, seated in shadow, that communicated more economically than any posture could, who had designed the present situation, and who had walked into it. "The boy is not here," Poirot said. "He was never on the ferry, but he is not here either, and he is not somewhere you can reach him. This I think you have already determined." He paused. "Sit down, if you please. I have some questions, and it would be more comfortable for both of us." A silence. Then Marinetti moved to the nearest pew and sat with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man choosing his responses one at a time. He folded his large hands together. He looked at Poirot across the dark nave with an expression that was, and this interested Poirot considerably, not hostile. Watchful, calculating, but not hostile. "The ledger," Marinetti said. "I have it. I have also the letter to the Swiss account and the copies of the Viscount's correspondence regarding Monsieur Holt's intentions, which Signora Rinaldi was kind enough to provide." Inspector Velarde has the originals of everything. He lodged as of this evening with the regional authority. Poirot let this settle. There is nothing left to suppress, Capitano. That moment has passed. Marinetti was quiet for a moment. Through the thick walls came the very distant sound of the sea, rhythmic and indifferent. The candle before the Madonna had burned lower, but held its thread of light with the tenacity of small flames in large spaces. "How much did you know?" Marinetti said. "And when did you know it?" It was, Poirot reflected, a revealing question. Not a denial, not a deflection, a request for a professional accounting from one precise mind to another. "I suspected you from the second day," Poirot said. "Your name on the Englishwoman's list, your absence from your office on the morning of the Boathouse fire. Your reaction, which was almost imperceptible, but not quite, when I mentioned the East Jetty." He tilted his head. "The camellias were intended to mislead me toward the Devereux family's history. They nearly did. It was a well-designed misdirection." "Nearly," Marinetti repeated. There was something in the word that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied the same neighbourhood. "The fatal error," Poirot said, "was the poem. You took it from a book you had obtained in order to understand the inheritance clause, a book associated with the Devereux name, which served your symbolic purpose. But the marginal note in that same book gave Miss Vance the countdown, the full moon, the 30 days. Once she brought that to me, the timetable became clear. And a clear timetable is a very useful thing when one is trying to understand who has a reason to act urgently." Marinetti looked at his folded hands for a long moment. "I discovered the clause 4 years ago," he said. "A legal document, misfiled. It came through the Harbour office because the Viscount had used a vessel registered here for the conveyance of estate papers years earlier. I read it. I understood what it meant." He said it without apology, as a man states the conditions under which a decision was made. "I had spent 16 years managing this harbour for wages that were adequate and no more. I knew this coast. I knew every family on it, and I knew that somewhere in this town there was a child who stood between Gerald Holt and an estate worth several £1,000,000. And Holt? Holt had already found me. He had been tracing the clause himself, and had identified the harbour as the key to any operation in Port Valmera. He made an approach. I considered his proposal for 6 months before I accepted it." Marinetti said this with the measured candour of a man who has decided, for his own reasons, to be truthful. He wanted the clause buried and the direct line eliminated. I arranged the Viscount's death, a genuine accident in appearance, which required care and local knowledge and a moonless night. The inquest found nothing because there was nothing findable. And when Margaret Vance arrived, she was closer than I had anticipated. The birth record, the Geneva lawyers, the annotated list. She had months of work behind her. I could not allow the legal challenge to be filed. A pause. "I regret the woman. That is not a thing I say lightly." Poirot regarded him steadily. "You regret her," he said. "And yet you arranged her death with the same care you arranged the Viscount's." "Yes." Marinetti met his eyes. "I regret her, and I arranged her death. Both things are true. I find that is frequently the case with decisions of that kind." He said it not as justification, but as observation, the statement of a man who has thought about this at some length and arrived at an account of himself that he considers honest, if not exculpatory. "The camellia was a mistake. I see that now. I believed it would create confusion, and it did, but confusion of the kind that draws a Hercule Poirot rather than repelling one. You had heard of me. I made it my business to know who was staying at the Grand Hotel. When I found out who you were, He paused. I adjusted my assessment of the situation's risk. But you proceeded nonetheless. The timetable did not permit otherwise. And I have never, Marinetti said with a simplicity that was more unsettling than pride would have been, abandoned a plan because it became difficult. The south door opened. Velarde entered, followed by 2 officers. He crossed the nave and stood at a distance of several meters, looking at Marinetti with the expression of a man encountering the distance between an abstraction and its human reality. Marinetti looked at him, then back at Poirot. "The boy," he said. "He will claim the inheritance." "That is a matter for the lawyers and for Nico Ferraro's own judgment," Poirot said. "It is no longer a matter for you." Marinetti nodded once, and as though this were a reasonable observation that he was prepared to accept. He rose from the pew without haste, settled his jacket, and looked at the candle burning before the Madonna with the expression of a man completing some private inventory. "A worthy opponent," he said to Poirot. His voice held no irony. Poirot inclined his head slightly. It was not precisely a reciprocal compliment, but it was an acknowledgement of the thing that had occurred between them across the past week. 2 people of exceptional attentiveness occupying the same small town, each fully aware of the other, neither able to afford the confirmation until the moment arrived. Velarde put his hand on Marinetti's arm. Marinetti went with him without resistance, without performance, and without looking back. The south door closed. Poirot sat alone in the nave for a moment, in the quiet and the candlelight, with the Madonna's painted Patience for company. His jacket was still slightly singed at the hem from the boathouse. His hat sat on the pew beside him. The candle before the altar had perhaps an hour remaining in it. He thought about a man of 16 years' dedicated service who had seen a number in a misfiled document and allowed it to rearrange everything he valued, about greed that presents itself as logic, about patience that is, in the end, only the long, careful form of the same desire. He thought about a Viscount who had spent 30 years trying to correct an old wrong and had run out of time 68 days before he could. Then he rose, collected his hat, and went to the vestry door. He knocked twice. "It is Poirot," he said. "Yet you may open the door." Chapter 10. What the Sea Returns. The arrest of Captain Luca Marinetti took place at dawn, on the steps of the harbour master's office in the presence of Inspector Velarde and 2 officers from the regional authority who had driven through the night from Genoa and arrived looking simultaneously tired and determined. There was no drama. Marinetti emerged from the building in his own time, correctly dressed, and descended the steps with the unhurried gravity of a man who has attended to everything that needed attending to, and is now prepared to go wherever the next thing requires. He paused at the bottom step. Poirot was standing at a slight remove, in the particular position he habitually occupied at such moments, close enough to observe everything, distant enough to belong to no party. And the morning was still and luminous, the harbour flat as pewter, the town not yet properly awake. A single gull stood on the bollard nearest the office door with its back to the proceedings, indifferent to human reckoning. Marinetti looked at Poirot. He gave a single nod, precise, neither warm nor cold, the acknowledgement of one professional to another, and then permitted the officers to accompany him to their vehicle without further comment. Poirot watched the car ascend the Harbour Road and disappear around the first bend in the hill, and stood for a moment in the quiet left behind. Then he adjusted his pocket square, which the night had not entirely disarranged, but which could not be said to be at its best, and turned back toward the hotel, Eos. The morning arranged itself around the aftermath with the practicality that mornings generally bring to situations that nights have made terrible. Velarde spent the early hours on the telephone to Genoa and to a pair of evidently surprised lawyers in Geneva, to whom the documentary evidence, the ledger, the letter, Isabella Rinaldi's copies of Adrian Devereux's correspondence, was transmitted by the most reliable means available. Gerald Holt's position, Velarde reported to Poirot at 8:30, with the dry satisfaction of a man closing a file, was understood to have deteriorated considerably by mid-morning. The lawyers in question were of the opinion that the matter of the inheritance would now proceed on its proper footing. The 30-day clause intact, the direct descendant alive and identifiable. The deadline, Poirot said, this evening, but the legal challenge was filed before midnight. Once I had the documents lodged with the regional authority, the Geneva lawyers confirm it is sufficient. Velarde looked at him with the expression of someone who has been considerably educated by a week's proximity to a particular method of thinking. The full moon was the deadline for the inheritance provision, not for the legal filing. Miss Vance's instinct about the timeline was correct. Miss Margaret Vance's instinct, Poirot said quietly. Yes. A pause between them that was not uncomfortable. We will write to her family, Velarde said, in England. He said it with a formality that was also, plainly, the acknowledgement that writing to families was among the least adequate responses to the situations that made it necessary. She had no other family, Poirot said, except the ones sitting in your Harbour church. He found Clara Vance in the library at 9 o'clock, which was where he had expected to find her. She had been there since before dawn. The concierge confirmed she had come down at 4, pale and unable to sleep, and had asked for the library to be unlocked. She sat now with Margaret's correspondence in front of her, and her own notebook closed beside it, in the attitude of a woman who has finished doing everything she is able to do and is resting in the resulting quiet. She looked up when Poirot entered. He told her what had happened, concisely and completely, because she had earned the complete account and because there was no kindness in withholding it. She listened without interrupting, or when he had finished she looked at the harbour for a long time through the library window. She was right, Clara said, about all of it. She was right about all of it, Poirot agreed. She was also, in coming here, very brave, and, in contacting me, very wise. He paused. I am sorry I could not do more. Clara Vance turned from the window. The grief in her face was present and acknowledged and not, Poirot noted with quiet respect, being used to perform anything. It was simply there, doing what grief does, in its own time and at its own pace. What will you do now? Poirot asked. She considered this with a seriousness that suggested she'd been considering it since long before he asked. I will finish the story, she said. Margaret began it. I will finish it and publish it. And make sure that what was done here is known. She looked at her notebook. And then, I think I will stay for a while. There is a boy who has just lost the closest thing to an uncle he had found, and a father who will need to make several very large decisions about his own life. I find I'm not quite ready to leave them to it alone. Poirot regarded her for a moment with the particular warmth he reserved for people who surprised him favourably. "That," he said, "is a most admirable decision." He visited Nico Ferraro and Thomas at the flower market in the late morning, where they had returned with the straightforward practicality of people for whom a stall is a stall, and flowers require tending regardless of the larger circumstances. Nico Ferraro was quiet, as he was always quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed. He had the look of a man who has been carrying a weight he did not know he was carrying, and has set it down, and is still adjusting to what it feels like to stand without it. Poirot did not press him. The question of the inheritance, whether Nico Ferraro would pursue his legal right as the Viscount's son, whether Thomas would grow up with a different understanding of what his name meant, was not a question with an obvious answer, and it was not Poirot's to answer. He had removed the danger. What the Ferraro family made of the space left behind was theirs entirely. "You will be contacted by lawyers," Poirot told him. "In due course. You are under no obligation to do anything at all, and under every obligation to do only what seems right to you." He paused. "If you require advice of a practical nature, Signora Rinaldi has offered her assistance. She was a friend of your father's, and she has, I think, a genuine desire to be useful." Nico Ferraro turned this over in his customary way. "The man who came to visit me," he said at last. "The one who wanted my silence. Holt's man. He will be identified. The ledger has his payments. Velarde is pursuing it." Poirot looked at him steadily. "He will not come again." Nico nodded once and returned to his flowers with the air of a man who has received adequate information and intends to do his thinking privately, which Poirot considered entirely his right. Thomas, who had been arranging carnations with focused industry at the far end of the stall, and following the entire conversation through its reflections in the glass of the shop window opposite, came forward when Poirot turned to leave. "Will you come back?" the boy asked. "To Port Valmera." Poirot considered the question with genuine attention. The harbour lay below them, shining in the late morning light, beautiful and particular and entirely itself. The white cliffs, the lazy boats, the promenade with its striped awnings and its violinist and its geometry of stacked oranges and chalkboard menus. A place that had looked like freedom and concealed a trap, and had now, perhaps, become a little more straightforwardly itself. "It is possible," he said. "I have not yet finished my holiday." He sat at his table at the Café Marianne at 12:30 in the September sun in his pale linen suit, with his pocket square in excellent condition and his moustache restored to its proper mathematical symmetry after the indignities of the preceding night. He ordered an egg. Off the waiter, a different one from his first morning, as it happened, but evidently briefed by his predecessor, brought it at 3 minutes and 15 seconds with the solemn precision of a ritual correctly performed, and set it before Poirot with an air of quiet professional pride. Poirot regarded it, tapped it once with the measured authority of long experience, found it correct. He sat for a moment before eating, looking at the harbour. A family of tourists was attempting to photograph itself against the sea wall with the cheerful, complicated disorganization that such projects generally involve. 2 old men had resumed, or perhaps continued without interruption, an argument of apparently geological duration conducted with espresso cups and much gesticulation. The violinist was playing something Poirot did not recognize, but which had the quality of a thing composed specifically for this particular light, on this particular water, at this particular time of year. Isabella Rinaldi's sailing ketch was still at its eastern berth, he knew, though it would not be there much longer. She had said she would stay until the legal matters were properly in motion, and then she would go south to somewhere warm and uncomplicated. And she had looked at the harbour when she said it with the expression of a woman who has done what she came to do and is ready to be done. Father Alonso had been at the sea wall this morning when Poirot passed, in his customary attitude of forward-gazing patience. But the quality of the waiting had changed. He was not waiting anymore. He was simply standing. Poirot ate his egg. He thought about Margaret Vance, who had spent 6 months on a truth that mattered and had not lived to see it established, and about the particular injustice of that timing, which could not be remedied and could not quite be accepted, and had to be carried as one carries these things, without pretending it is lighter than it is. He thought about a Viscount with a 68-day deficit and a long, inadequately tended guilt, about a harbour master who had read a number in a misfiled document and allowed it to colonise 16 years of an otherwise ordinary life, about greed which presents itself with such plausible familiarity, as calculation, as reasonableness, as simply understanding how the world works, that a man may pursue it for a very long time without ever calling it by its proper name. And he thought, with some satisfaction that he did not attempt to diminish because it was honest, about a boy selling flowers from his father's stall on a promenade beside a sea that kept its secrets in the ordinary way of seas. Not out of malice, but simply because no one had yet asked the right questions in the right order. Poirot had asked them. He finished his egg, folded his napkin, and signalled the waiter for a second coffee with the unhurried authority of a man whose morning has gone well, and whose afternoon is entirely his own. Below the promenade, the harbour moved in its ancient, unconcerned way. Boats left. Children ran along the sea wall. The sun fell across the white cliffs and the blue water and the small cafes and the old men with their espresso cups and the whole intricate, imperfect, continuously astonishing spectacle of people going about their lives. Hercule Poirot watched it with considerable pleasure. His holiday, he decided, had been most eventful, and the egg, at last, was perfect.